So, good morning, everyone. We'll start as usual with prayers and then do a little bit of meditation on topic from the previous class. And while doing the prayers and the meditation, you can imagine the Buddha in front of you, made of light, pure, radiant, transparent, very much alive, with all his excellent qualities of love and compassion for you and all other living beings, wisdom, understanding the true nature of all things, and all other excellent qualities fully developed, fully perfected, free of every kind of fault, mistake, obstruction, obscuration. And think that this image of the Buddha, this figure of the Buddha, represents all the other objects of refuge, all three jewels, all the spiritual masters of the past and the present. So as we recite the prayers, you can direct them to the Buddha as the embodiment of all objects of refuge.
To the teacher and Tao, transcendent destroyer, one thus gone, foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one gone to bliss, knower of the world, supreme guide of beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans to you, the Buddha and Tao, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I bow. With pure bodies formed supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best supreme guide, to you I bow. With the supreme signs, face like the spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not incomparable, wise one, to you I bow. Great, compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms. Unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom, too well established in the trainings. The holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, 4 lands, sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you. May all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
So take a few moments to make sure that your reason, your motivation for sitting here, being part of this class, doing meditation, listening to the teachings and so on, is for the benefit of all sentient beings, to be able to help them as much as possible from this time on, and in an ultimate sense, to work for Buddhahood, enlightenment, in order to benefit all living beings in the best possible way. So for the meditation, we are going through the middle scope or medium scope section of the Lamrim, and we started looking at the afflictions, which the Buddha explained as the chief cause of all suffering, all dukkha, all problems. And we also have coming up a weekend retreat on anger, which is one of the main afflictions. So let's start to explore that particular affliction. So bring to mind an experience that you have had of anger. It could be the full-blown variety where you just get totally angry at someone and may even want to lash out and do something harmful. Or something more low level like aversion, irritation, impatience. Now bring to mind one such experience that you've had. And then ask yourself, how did that state of mind affect you? How did it affect your general mood, your state of mind? How did it affect your body and your behavior? Just think about the effects that the angry state of mind had on you. And how do you think it affected other people who may have been around you at that time? So do you think these effects of anger, both on yourself and on others, are beneficial or harmful? So fortunately, anger and other afflictions are not permanent, they're not frozen, fixed, always there, but instead they are impermanent, transitory. They come and go in our mind. And when they do arise, there are things we can use, like tools, strategies, to manage them so they don't overwhelm us. Gradually, we can reduce their strength and frequency and learn to transform our mind into a state that is more positive and virtuous and beneficial. So see if you can resolve to do this, to learn the methods for working on anger and other afflictions. And then when you do notice one of them arising in your mind, to use those methods to the best of your ability. Okay. So in the last class we had 2 weeks ago, we were going through the upper realms and looking at the kind of sufferings, or dukkha, that one experiences there. And Venerable Deki asked a question about Pure Lands. Are they in samsara? Now I said I would look into that. So in volume 3, which you probably did a couple of years ago, right? Page 44, that's early on in the book. So there's a little explanation there. And it says, well, first it starts talking about what are called 5 pure abodes. So there's pure lands and pure abodes, and they're not the same thing. So the pure abodes are in the 4th concentration of the form realm. So the form realm consists of 4 areas, which are called concentrations. First concentration, second concentration, third concentration, and 4th concentration. And each of those has 3 divisions, 3 levels, making 12 altogether. But then, in addition to that, in the 4th concentration, there are 5 extra places, which are called 5 pure abodes. And to be born in those, you have to be an Arya. So you have to be someone who has directly realized emptiness. So those are, exclusive exclusive clubs only for Aryas. Anyway, those are called the 5 pure abodes. And those are part of samsara, even though you have to be an Arya to be born in those, but they're still considered to be part of samsara. And those 5 pure abodes are different from pure lands. And pure lands, there's 2 types of pure lands. One is related to Nirmanakaya, the emanation bodies of Buddhas, like Amitabha's Pure Land, Sukhavati. And there's another one called Abhirati, which is related to Akshobhya Buddha. So those are Nirmanakaya Pure Lands. And then there's also Sambhogakaya Pure Lands, enjoyment body Pure Lands. So Pure Lands, all the Pure Lands are not samsaric realms. Okay, so those are not considered part of samsara. They're also called Buddha lands. That's another term you sometimes encounter, Buddha land. Have you ever heard that? Buddha land. So Buddha land and Pure Land are synonymous. So they're not part of samsara. And then later in that volume on page 258, it says, some ordinary beings are born in Pure Lands, like Sukhavati, as a result of special virtuous karma and sincere virtuous aspirations and prayers to take rebirth there. Birth in Amitabha's and Akshobhya's Pure Lands is not taken under the power of afflictions and karma, and is not in the 12 links. So there are ordinary beings who can be born in Sukhavati. So they're still ordinary beings. They haven't, even had a realization of emptiness. But because of a strong practice, creating a lot of virtue, making strong prayers, they can be born in like Sukhavati. But that kind of birth doesn't happen under the power of afflictions and karma as normal, like rebirth in samsara does. They're not part of the 12 links. Although many beings born in those Pure Lands still have self-grasping and other afflictions, these do not arise in manifest form. So they haven't abandoned afflictions, but they don't come up in a strong way, in a manifest way. So they don't create karma for rebirth in unfortunate realms. So while they're there in those pure lands, they don't create any more karma for lower rebirth. Because they practice the path diligently, they no longer create karma for rebirth in samsara, and they attain full awakening in the Pure Land. So Pure Lands are not samsaric realms, although samsaric beings who are still in samsara, not having attained nirvana or enlightenment, can be born there. So that makes sense. It's a little complicated, all these different kinds of realms. And then in volume 3, in the glossary, the entry for Pure Land says, places created by the unshakable resolve and merit of Buddhas, where all external conditions are conducive for Dharma practice. So Pure Lands are not at all like samsaric realms, but rather Buddhas, enlightened beings, kind of create them through their merit and compassion for sentient beings. They want to offer a place for sentient beings to practice the Dharma. Okay, so we will continue where we left off. We were on page 168, looking at the actual identification of the mental afflictions. So here there's a list of 10 afflictions, which are basically the 6 root afflictions that you learn about in like Lorig. And the 6th of those is called afflicted views, and that has 5 divisions. So when you divide that, you add on those 5 divisions, it makes 10 altogether. So last time we looked at the first 5, desire, anger, pride, ignorance, doubt, which is more correctly called deluded doubt, because not all doubt is afflicted. Some doubt is actually very healthy. But deluded doubt is when you have doubt about something like karma, rebirth, the possibility of attaining enlightenment, and you're leaning towards the wrong conclusion, like there probably isn't anything like karma or rebirth, enlightenment, and so on. So you're inclined towards that conclusion. Okay, so that's as far as we got last time. So we'll start now with number 6. So the last 5 of these afflictions are all views. And all of them are called afflicted intelligence. So they are the mental factor of, it's sometimes translated as wisdom, prajna or sherab in Tibetan. And so that mental factor, it's often translated as wisdom, as in the perfection of wisdom. But here it's translated as intelligence, which is probably more appropriate since these are afflicted. It's kind of strange to say afflicted wisdom. And so the fact that that mental factor can sometimes be afflicted means it isn't necessarily positive and virtuous and beneficial. And the definition of that mental factor says that it individually differentiates the faults and virtues of objects of analysis. And so it's the mental factor that sort of investigates, analyzes something in order to understand it. And in the process of investigating and trying to understand this object, it sometimes gets it right. For example, when we generate the wisdom, understanding emptiness, or the other kinds of wisdom, understanding impermanence, and so on. So sometimes as a result of this investigation, we have a correct understanding, but sometimes after analyzing, we get it wrong. So, as in these 5 types of views. So they're all a kind of intelligence, but an afflicted one. And the explanation of these 5 views here is common to all the tenet systems, all the different schools of philosophy. And Lama Tsongkhapa only mentions that at the end of this section, page 169. He says, these are the mental afflictions as identified from the perspective that is common to both the higher and lower tenet systems. The Prasangika Madhyamaka system will be explained below. It doesn't say where, but maybe in the section on insight. So yeah, the way they're explained here isn't necessarily the way that the Prasangikas explain it, particularly with the first one. So the first one, number 6 of the 10 afflictions, is the view of the transitory collection. That's the usual translation of the Tibetan term, which is Jigtsokitawa, and this is quite a literal translation. A view of transitory collection. Venerable Chodron uses the term view of personal identity, which is more of a description of what it is rather than a literal translation. And because the term is so long, I tend to use the abbreviated Tibetan term, which is Jigta, 2 syllables. Jigta is an abbreviation of the Jigtsokitawa. So it's, view of the transitory collection. So if that term comes out of my mouth, just understand what I'm talking about. Okay, so here it says, the view of the transitory collection is an afflicted intelligence that observes the appropriated aggregates and views them as a self or belonging to a self, thinking I or mine. And it's not really clear here when it uses the term self. It's actually a false type of self, because we do talk about a conventional self. There is a self that exists that isn't false, but here it's a false sense of self. And if you want to talk about it in terms of all the tenet systems, all the schools of philosophy, it would be the self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So all the Buddhist schools agree that that type of self doesn't exist, is something non-existent, and yet sentient beings, samsaric beings, have a view that there is such a self. There's an I that is self-supporting, substantially existent, and that's the kind of self that seems to be like the ruler, the boss, the CEO, the one controlling our aggregates. So that's the meaning of this state of mind, the view of the transitory collection. So it views or observes the aggregates, the body and mind, and thinks there's a real self-sufficient, substantially existent self, an I, and then also mine. Okay, so that's there's a lot of discussion about what mine refers to, but the one that makes most sense to me is it's the I in the role of owner. So it's not so much the objects that are owned, the objects that are possessed, but rather the possessor. an I that is the owner of my body, my books, my computer, and so on. Because it is about a self, it's not about those kind of objects. And then it goes on here, transitory means impermanent, and collection means multiple. So the object that it views is a mere impermanent and manifold phenomenon. It is given the name view of the transitory collection to indicate there is no permanent unitary person. So a lot of non-Buddhist schools, like at the time of the Buddha and even nowadays, various Indian schools of philosophy actually believe that there is a permanent unitary person or self or soul, Atman, that there's some part of a person, a being that is permanent, unchanging, and separate from the body and the mind, something whole and without parts, and independent of causes and conditions. So the Buddha and all the Buddhist schools refute the existence of that type of self, that type of person, and on top of that also refute a more subtle false sense of self, the self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So again, that explanation of this view, jigta, view of the transitory collection, is common to all the Buddhist schools. So I think all the non-Prasangika schools would agree with that, but the Prasangikas have a different explanation of this one. You've learned it before, but it probably doesn't hurt to go through it again. So basically this particular view is a type of self-grasping ignorance. So it's an ignorance grasping at a self, but in particular it's grasping at just one's own self, just me, I, and not other persons or other phenomena. It's just about I. And that's said to be the root of all our suffering, the root of all other afflictions and karma and being in samsara and experiencing all the suffering. It's all rooted in this misconception of our own self, our own I. And so as for Prasangika, the way they explain it, I'll read what it says in volume 3, page 78. It says, according to the lower Buddhist schools, a view of a personal identity observes the aggregates and mistakenly believes them to be a self-sufficient, substantially existent I and mine, a person that controls the aggregates, and a person that owns the aggregates. Here, the observed object is the aggregates, and the apprehended or conceived object is a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. The view of a personal identity is mistaken with respect to its apprehended and conceived objects because it believes the aggregates to be a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, although they are not. And in fact, there is no such thing anywhere in the universe as a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. And I think to understand how this works, it can be helpful to think of that analogy of the rope and the snake that we hear about a lot, when you're outside in the garden and it's kind of dark, not much light, and you see a rope on the ground, and it may have stripes on it, and it's shaped in a certain way that, your mind thinks it's a snake. So there's this moment of thinking, there's a snake there. And then fear comes up and other kinds of disturbing thoughts and emotions. So there's no snake there at all. Okay, it's just a rope or a hose, a garden hose or something like that. Not a snake at all, nothing that can harm you. So it's a case of misapprehension, misconception. And so this state of mind, jigta, is kind of similar in that it observes the aggregates, our 5 aggregates, none of which is a real self, a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, but this state of mind thinks there is a self here. And so it mistakenly perceives and conceives our aggregates, thinking they are something that they are not. And then all the different emotions come up as a result of that. We have attachment to me and my friends, my possessions, and so on. And then we have aversion, hostility towards others we see as threatening, or we just don't like them, or whatever. And all the other afflictions arise from that. So it's like a hallucination, seeing a rope as a snake or seeing a mirage as water. Okay, so again, in the desert, you have these conditions producing this appearance that looks like water, but there isn't a drop of water there. Okay, so that's what the other schools say. And for the Prasangikas, Volume 3 says, according to the view unique to the Prasangikas, view of a personal identity observes the mere I and mine. Okay, so instead of observing the aggregates, it observes the mere I and the mere mine, which means the I and the mine that exist by being merely designated in dependence on the aggregates. So that's the conventional I. Conventionally existing I is what is merely named or labeled or designated on or in relation to our aggregates. So that's the object observed according to the Prasangikas, not the aggregates. Not the aggregates themselves, but the I that is labeled, imputed to the aggregates. So that's what's observed, and then it erroneously grasps the I and mine to be inherently existing. Okay, so it observes this merely labeled I and thinks that it's not merely labeled, but inherently existing. So again, it's a case of mistaken conception, misapprehension of what really does exist. So here the observed object is the mere I and mine, and the apprehended and conceived objects are an inherently existent I and mine. So that's another difference between the Prasangikas and the other schools, because they only talk about believing there's a self-sufficient, substantially existent I, which is a kind of grosser, false notion of self, whereas the Prasangikas talk about the inherently existent I, which is a subtler version of a false sense of self. So yeah, what the difference between the Prasangikas and the other schools is both the observed object, what is observed by this view of the transitory collection, and what it apprehends, this mistaken idea that it has about the I and mine. Does that make sense? It's difficult, this one. But it is important to know, because this really is the root of all our suffering and problems. Then, next, number 7, the view holding to an extreme is an afflicted intelligence that observes the self as it is apprehended by the view of the transitory collection, and views it as either permanent and eternal, or as being annihilated, without being reborn from this existence to a future one. So again, it's an intelligence, but one that got things wrong, and it's based on believing in this false sense of self, I, and mine, and then on top of that, believing that this kind of self or I is either permanent, eternal. So, for example, many religions believe in a soul, some part of us that will live forever and ever and ever and ever. And the way they view this self or soul is incorrect. They think of it as something, real and permanent and so on. So that's one possible view, or viewing that wrong notion of self and thinking that it goes out of existence at the time of death. So again, there's a lot of people who believe that, especially nowadays. I think materialists is one term. Many people think that when we die, everything goes out of existence. There's nothing left of us. No mind, no thoughts, no feelings, no soul, no self. We just completely go out of existence. So again, based on a mistaken notion of self, I, me, then thinking that notion of self goes out of existence. So basically, these are the two extreme views, permanence and nihilism. There's different terms for permanence. What does Venerable call it? Reification or eternalism? Absolutism. Yeah, different translations of that term. So that's one. And then nihilism, I don't think there's too many different translations of that one. That's pretty standard view of annihilation. So of those two wrong views, probably nihilism is more harmful, more dangerous, because if you have a view of permanence or absolutism, then you might still think that it's worth living a virtuous life, creating virtue. Because if you believe there's an afterlife, there's a real soul, a real I, a real me that's going to continue after death, and if you believe there's, heaven and hell, you want to go to heaven and avoid hell. So that will prompt you to create virtue, to live a good life and help others and so on and so forth, and try to avoid non-virtue. So it can lead to, living a good life and hopefully having a good rebirth in the next life. Whereas the view of annihilation, the nihilistic view, they say that one is dangerous, because that can lead you to think anything matters, anything goes, whatever I do is okay. I don't think that's necessarily the case with everybody, but it could be. Some people might have a materialistic, nihilistic view, but still see the benefit in living a good life and being a good person, helping others. But some people become really careless and just, what the heck, I can do anything. And then they may engage in a lot of non-virtue, creating suffering for themselves and also for others. So that view can be more dangerous, more harmful. Then, next one, number 8. Now, the view holding a bad view to be best is an afflicted intelligence that observes any of these three: the view of the transitory collection, the view holding to an extreme, or a wrong view. Wrong view is number 9 in this list, which we come to next. 10, number 10 on the list. So any of those three, if you hold that view, and on top of that, you think this is the best view there is. My view is supreme, is the best, better than everybody else's view. So you're strongly attached to it. And it also mentions the aggregates of the person holding the view based on which the view arises. and holds that view to be the best. So the way it's explained in volume 3 is that it regards the view of the personal identity, the view of extremes, or a wrong view as correct and supreme views, there being no higher views. And with regard to our aggregates, it also views our own 5 aggregates as supreme, thinking there is no better body, feelings, and so on. So holding our aggregates as supreme as well. I have the best aggregates of all. And it says, while wrong views can be abandoned comparatively easily, when we hold them as supreme, they become deeply entrenched in our minds and thus more difficult to overcome. Okay, so if you have this really exaggerated notion about your views and probably a lot of arrogance, pride about your views, and comparing your views with other views and thinking yours best, then it becomes harder to overcome those and see them as mistaken. Okay, number 9 is the view holding ethics and ascetic practices to be best. This is an afflicted intelligence that observes ethics. This is not very clear here, I find. It observes ethics of giving up immorality and ascetic practices that set a certain dress code, manners, and bodily or verbal comportment, as well as the aggregates through which the view arises, and views them as sufficient for purifying bad actions, liberating from the mental afflictions, and releasing one from cyclic existence. So when it says in that second line, it observes ethics, I think we could put in brackets faulty ethics. It's mistaken ethics, mistaken notions of ethical conduct. So examples of this that existed at the time of the Buddha and maybe still today, various spiritual practitioners would do things like standing on one leg, continuously for days and months and years, or sitting in the middle of 5 fires. They would have like 4 bonfires in the 4 directions, and then the sun above, and bathing in the Ganges, thinking that that will purify all your negative karma. Sacrificing animals. So there's lots of different kinds of practices that have been done and are done by people, thinking that these practices are means to purify yourself of your karma, your afflictions, and even in some cases they think this will lead to liberation, nirvana. But yeah, from the Buddhist point of view, they are faulty, they are erroneous. These are not methods for purifying the mind and attaining nirvana. And I was wondering if nowadays, I think there are people who think that taking certain types of drugs like ayahuasca can lead to enlightenment. You can attain enlightenment by taking those drugs. So maybe that would be another example, contemporary example. Because there are certain rituals you go through in that. I haven't done it, but just what I've heard. Then 10 is wrong views. A wrong view is an afflicted intelligence that makes denials, like saying that past and future lives actions and their effects and the like do not exist, or that superimposes the apprehension of Ishvara, a fundamental nature and the like, as the causes of sentient beings. So in general, a wrong view is either denying the existence of something that does exist and is important for our spiritual practice, like karma, rebirth, the existence of the enlightenment, and so on. So denying such things, or believing in something that actually doesn't exist, like a divine creator. There's some kind of being that created this whole world and all of us, and so on. So those are the 5 views, which are all afflicted views. And again, Lama Tsongkhapa says, these are the mental afflictions as identified from the perspective that is common to both the higher and lower tenet systems. So all the different Buddhist schools would agree with this, but there's a unique explanation by the Prasangikas, which will come later, maybe in the special insight section. Any questions?
So going back to the view of the extremes, I sometimes get a little hung up on where modern materialists fit into this, because it seems that here the definition says it's based on the intelligence that observes the self as it is apprehended by the view of the transitory collection. But when I think of the scientific materialists, you know, kind of the most extreme form, saying, well, I am just molecules and electrical impulses. And that point, I'm not sure that they're saying there is a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So does that view actually fall under the view of the transitory aggregates?
Well, I mean, even if they say intellectually, I am, you know, what we are is just molecule. What did you say? Molecules and electrical impulses. Does that mean they don't have this innate, instinctive grasping at a self, at an I? For example, when they get into a traffic jam, do they get upset? So I think it's one thing to have, you know, notions, ideas, beliefs, you know, that are more intellectual, but those may not affect at all your kind of gut level feelings, you know. So I mean, according to the, you know, all the Buddhist schools, every sentient being, even animals, even babies, newborn babies, all have this innate grasping at a, you know, wrong notion of self or I. And I don't think that that's going to go away just by studying science and, you know, having these kind of notions about things. So I would think that, yeah, they probably do, unless they've realized emptiness, unless they actually had a, you know, gone through the process of recognizing the object of negation, using reasoning to refute it, and, you know, gained a realization of that, then they probably still have it. Because there's 2 levels of this wrong view. There's the innate that everybody has, we're all born with, all the beings in samsara have. And then there's also intellectually acquired one, which if you study certain philosophies that teach the existence of that kind of self, then that would, you know, reinforce the innate one. But even without studying such philosophies, we all do have that innate notion of self. View of the transitory collection.
I'm always puzzled with this particular one, because only the first one of these is innate. Is that correct? And the rest are all acquired?
Oh, yeah, I have to check. I forget. It's not mentioned here, but that one is innate. And I forget. And definitely some of the others are only acquired. Like number 9 definitely is only acquired. Not everybody has that one. Only those who've studied certain religious, traditions. Extreme view. I can't remember. Can anyone else remember which ones are acquired, which ones are innate? I can look it up.
Yeah, and I can check too. It's just in my memory, because I always
Yeah.
kind of think of them as like a subset then of the view of the transitory collection. All the many possible damaging permutations from that. But I don't know, it just confuses me that they're mixed in there, like acquired and innate.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll check that and come back with it next week.
Two of these views, other than the view of the transitory collection, refers to aggregates, like view of holding a bad view to be best. So references the 3 wrong views and then mentions the aggregates of the person holding the view based on which the view arises. So I'm wondering why the aggregates are factored in.
Yeah, it's not always explained, I think, like when you're going through the mental factors, when these are explained in the context of the 51 mental factors. I don't think it mentions the aggregates, so I'm a little surprised about that as well. Well, where that comes from, maybe it's just from one of the classic Indian texts. Yeah, I wonder if that really is, like if you, with number 8, holding a bad view is the best. If you have a wrong view, and then on top of that, you regard that as the supreme view, do you necessarily also regard your aggregates of body and mind to be the best? I mean, it could be if you have, kind of an arrogant attitude, if you're strongly arrogant, then you could easily be arrogant about every aspect of yourself. My body, my mind, every part of me is supreme, including my views. My ideas about things are supreme. But I just wonder if that is always the case. I don't know. Anyone else? Okay, so those are the 10 main afflictions. There's other afflictions as well, but they're not mentioned here. Then the next section is the stages by which the mental afflictions arise. Okay, so this is a little complicated. There's different views. So it says, if the view of the transitory collection and ignorance are posited as distinct, the stages of how the mental afflictions arise must be understood in the following manner. So in other explanations, it said that the so-called 2 abhidharmas, the higher abhidharma and the lower abhidharma, the lower abhidharma is represented by Vasubandhu, who wrote the Treasury of Knowledge, the Abhidharma Kosha. And the higher Abhidharma is represented by a Sangha, who wrote the Abhidharma Samuchaya. So the 2 brothers, Vasubandhu and a Sangha. So according to them, the view of the transitory collection and ignorance are different. Ignorance, they explain ignorance as just a state of confusion, like being in the dark, being confused. And then the view of the transitory collection is, a mistaken view about our own self, I, me. So that's their view. So according to them, then the way the mental afflictions arise is like this. For instance, once darkness has fallen on a coiled rope, the mind will apprehend it as a snake if the state of the rope is not clear. Likewise, because the darkness of ignorance obscures the clear state of the aggregates, the delusion regarding the aggregates as a self arises, and from that the other mental afflictions arise. So their explanation is, first there's ignorance, which is a darkness, the mind being in the dark, not able to see things clearly. Based on that, then looking at one's own aggregates, we misapprehend them and think that there's a real self, a real I, a real me. And then based on that, attachment, aversion, and other afflictions arise. So that's how they explain it. So they make a difference between ignorance and the view of the transitory collection. Then there's another version. It says, if those two, meaning ignorance and the view of the transitory collection, are posited as the same. So this is the system of masters like Dharmakirti and Chandrakirti. So according to their texts, their explanations, they say that the view of the transitory collection and ignorance are the same. The view of the transitory collection itself is the root of mental afflictions. In fact, when the view of the transitory collection apprehends a self, a distinction is made between self and other. Once that is made, attachment to one's own side and hatred for the other side arise. Othering. Also, conceit arises upon observing that self. That's another term for arrogance. That very self is then held to be permanent or subject to annihilation and is viewed as the self and so forth. Then the bad activities connected with it are upheld as supreme. Likewise, wrong views are generated that think the teacher who taught selflessness, the actions and effects he taught, the four truths, the three jewels, and so forth, do not exist. Or alternatively, the doubt is generated that thinks, do they exist or not? Are they a certain way or are they not? And there's a quote from Dharmakirti's commentary on Compendium of Valid Cognition, saying, when there's a self, there's awareness of other. Dividing between them brings grasping and anger. Every fault comes into being closely connected with those two. Okay, so it seems that the first paragraph, the first version of how the afflictions arise, says that ignorance, this state of unknowing, confusion, being in the dark, that's the beginning. That's like the root from which all the other afflictions arise. And then in the second view, it's the root of, the view of the transitory collection that is the root of all the afflictions. And they say that is the same as ignorance. They explain ignorance to be self-grasping ignorance rather than just darkness, being in the dark, being confused. That's what it means. I think, yeah, that analogy of the rope and the snake is helpful. just to understand how we misapprehend, misconceive our aggregates, just like a person can misapprehend a rope and think that it's a snake and then get all emotional about that. That clear? And I think with that verse from Dharmakirti, Pamanavartika, when he says, when there's a self, there's awareness of others. So he doesn't explicitly say it, but the way we apprehend ourselves and the way we apprehend others is wrong. You know, just as we see ourself in a mistaken way as either a self-sufficient, substantially existent self or an inherently existing self, we also see others as existing in that way too. There's a real, solid, permanent self, person over there, whether it's my friend or my enemy or strangers. And that wrong way of seeing people and living beings, I think, enhances any afflictions that we have. Like the enemy, you know, there's this inherently existing person, bad guy, idiot, fool, whatever. we think about that person. And so thinking of them as inherently existing kind of fuels the anger and the hatred. If we saw there was no such thing as an inherently existing self or person, we just see a merely labeled person over there who happens to have a lot of afflictions, behaves in afflicted ways, but we wouldn't, we would be able to avoid anger and hatred towards them. Yeah, so we see everyone and everything in a wrong way, a mistaken way. And that underlies all these afflictions. And that's why realizing emptiness, the lack of any inherent existence in self, in others, in phenomena, that pulls the rug out from under all the afflictions. They have nothing to stand on anymore, no basis to get angry, to have attachment, and so on. I don't know. That's what I imagine. I would like to experience that for myself, but yeah, that's how it works. Yeah.
What kind of practices could we do to reduce that belief in separation between self and other?
Well, I mean, we are different. We are separate. It's not that we are all the same. So we do have to acknowledge that each one of us is a unique individual. But then, what comes to mind are in the meditations for cultivating love and compassion, equanimity. We're all the same and that we all want happiness and we don't want to suffer. We're all samsaric beings who are stuck in samsara because of our karma and afflictions, but we have the potential to get out. So I find that really helpful, just to contemplate the ways in which we are all the same. And we're all impermanent. So, we're changing all the time. There's no permanence in any aspect of our being, any of our aggregates. So we're changing all the time. And just the ways in which we are the same. I find that really helpful to even out, balance out our feelings for others. And working on overcoming self-centeredness, the self-centered attitude. I think that really helps as well. And cultivating altruism, thinking more about others and wanting to benefit others and so on. Lots of things. Oh, we're not there yet. Okay, so next is the faults of the mental afflictions. And there's a lot of many of which you've probably heard before, but doesn't hurt to go through them again. Okay, so ornament for the Mahayana Sutras. This is one of Maitreya's texts. It says, the mental afflictions destroy you, destroy sentient beings, and destroy your ethics. You become lax and poor. Guardians and teachers revile you. There will be nasty disputes. You will take rebirth elsewhere in unfree states. Through the loss of what you had attained or had hoped to attain, there is great mental suffering. And then there's these verses from Shantideva's Entering the Bodhisattva Way, or what's it called? Another term, engaging in the Bodhisattva's deeds, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. Anyway, so this is from chapter 4. It says, enemies such as hatred and craving do not have arms, legs, and so on. They have no valor either. So why is it that they have reduced me to servitude? That's really powerful to think about. They're not even physical. There's nothing material, nothing substantial about these afflictions. No arms, no legs, no weapons. They can't hold a gun to our head and force us to do something we don't want to do. And yet, that's what happens. They come up in our mind and we just let ourselves be taken over, controlled by them, and then acting out, in unwise, unskillful ways. While abiding in my mind, they happily inflict harm on me. The patience that does not get angry at them is unsuitable, blameworthy patience. So we tend to be patient with our afflictions. We allow them, we tolerate them to remain within our mind and do what they want, which, is to make us suffer, create suffering for us. So this is inappropriate patience, especially if we don't have much patience for other sentient beings, right? We get very impatient with them, but we are patient with our own afflictions. Something wrong there. Even if the gods and demigods were all to rise as enemies against me, they could not lead or put me into the fires of the Avicii hell. So we could also think of all the armies in the world, with all their powerful weapons, tanks and missiles and nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. So even all those armies, if they were fighting against us, they wouldn't be able to cause me to be born in hell. They could, do a lot of damage to me in this lifetime, but they couldn't make me go to hell. But then he says, the mental afflictions, these powerful foes, throw me into it in one instant, where nothing met with, not even Mount Meru, is left behind, not even ashes. So, this is talking about the worst hell, the lowest hell, which, the greatest suffering. So what can cause me to go to that situation, be in that situation, are the afflictions. Afflictions in my mind, for example, getting angry and then acting out of anger, especially anger at some holy being or holy object, like a Buddha, Bodhisattva, our spiritual teacher. So even just a moment of anger, if we don't purify it, of course it can be purified, but if we just leave it without purifying, then that could be the cause to throw us into this terrible suffering situation. Compared to my foes, the mental afflictions, protracted with neither beginning nor end, not one of all my other enemies could possibly endure so long. So it says without beginning or end. It's true that they are without beginning, because it said that afflictions have been in our mind from beginningless time. They've always been there. There's no beginning to that. And so, in all our previous lives, countless previous lives, we've had afflictions, and they've caused so much suffering for us. And if we don't do anything about them, then they will be without end. Then there will be no end. They won't go away by themselves. They're not just going to die out, a natural death. But they will continue to be in our mind until we take action and work on overcoming them, and especially developing the real antidote, which is the wisdom of emptiness, the wisdom of directly realizing emptiness. So that's really the only antidote, the only thing that can eliminate them, but it can. So with that wisdom realizing emptiness, we can completely eliminate the afflictions, and then they will come to an end. And so they are much worse than any external enemies. They do much more damage to us. While everyone helps you and makes you happy when you act harmoniously and with reverence, if you attend to mental afflictions, they inflict suffering and harm in return. So I think what that means is that with external enemies, it may be possible to befriend them. If we are nice to them and we make offerings to them and treat them well, then they might change and become our friends and help us instead of harming us. So that may happen with external enemies. But with our afflictions, if we're nice to our afflictions, they are just going to make us suffer. They're never going to be nice to us. They're always going to be the cause of suffering. So that's another difference between external enemies and the internal ones. So it's the internal ones that are the real problem. Reflect on the faults stated here. Gumpawa said, to eliminate the mental afflictions, you must know their faults, their definitions, their antidotes, and the causes for their arising. Once you have understood their faults, you should see them as faults and apprehend them as enemies. If you do not understand their faults, you will not understand them to be enemies. Therefore, you should contemplate them along the lines of the statements from Ornament for the Mahayana Sutras and Entering the Bodhisattva Way. Yeah, so it's really, really important to contemplate the different faults of the afflictions, the drawbacks, both what's mentioned here, but also in our own experience. I find it really helpful just to look at your own experience and what happens when anger arises, when attachment arises, and so on. How do they affect us in an immediate sense? They affect our body, they affect our mind, our behavior, other aspects of our life, daily life, relationships, and so on. So just really get a firsthand experience of what kind of problems arise from afflictions, and also looking in the world around, stories of, things that happen with other people as a result of their afflictions. So that way we can see more and more clearly how afflictions just lead to suffering, not happiness, not benefit. So yeah, we have to be really convinced that afflictions are harmful. They're like poison or like scams. I think a good analogy is scams. I don't know if I get these emails sometimes telling me that I have just purchased a new iPhone, and this much money, $700 or something, has been subtracted from my account, and if I didn't make this purchase, I have to call this number. You get those? Yeah. So the first time I got one of those, I sort of believed it. But then I realized, no, that's a scam. But yeah, I guess a lot of people fall for these scams and they get themselves burned and robbed, and all kinds of problems happen. So it's really sad. So it's really important to be aware of scams and not fall for them. So in a similar way, we need to be aware of the inner scams. So afflictions are like scams. They're telling us, oh, if you make friends with this person, you will live happily ever after. If you buy this object, it will bring you so much happiness. If you avoid that person or treat that person badly, then, you'll feel really good about yourself. Whatever. So, yeah, we have to pay attention to what the afflictions are telling us and do a reality check. And, after a while, you just know, no, that one is wrong. That's just a scam. So then you could just avoid it. I'll try to finish this section. Okay, then it says, and in order to know the definitions of the mental afflictions, you should also study the Abhidharma, at least explanation of the 5 aggregates. I think that may be a text by Chandrakirti. Vasubandhu. Once you have become acquainted with the root and secondary afflictions, you will identify attachment, anger, and so forth, whatever it is, as soon as they arise in your mind stream, thinking, this is that. Oh no, it has arisen. Another scam. Watch out. And you will then fight the mental afflictions. This kind of understanding is necessary. So yeah, this book doesn't go into all those details, all the definitions and all the different antidotes, the causes for their arising. But volume 3 has really, really good explanation, as you know, pages and pages of explanation of the afflictions and how to identify them, and also antidotes to them. And the causes, there's this list of 6, they're actually called factors, 6 factors, causes, conditions for afflictions arising. Those are really helpful to know. Do you remember what they are? Yeah, first one is latency or seed or imprint. We already have within our mind a seed, an imprint or latency that can cause an affliction to come up once we have the right conditioning, like water on a seed. And then the second one is objects, right? So encountering objects that trigger, the objects are like the trigger, or the water to nourish those seeds. So it's not their fault. It's not the fault of those people or beings or objects. If we didn't have the seed of afflictions in our mind, then they wouldn't arise. So we shouldn't blame the objects. But yeah, that's one of the factors. And so, yeah, if there's certain objects that you notice often trigger afflictions, then it's good to be careful, try not to be around those objects too much. That's why it's good to live in a monastery, not watch TV and movies and so on. So there's less objects to trigger afflictions. And then influences, yeah. So the people you hang out with, another reason it's good to live in a monastery. Try to be with people who are trying to work on their afflictions rather than actively engaged in them, feeding them, enjoying them, so that otherwise that can rub off on us, and we'll find ourselves more afflicted. And then, yeah, there's different. Yeah, I mean, one version is false teachings. Some books say false teachings, or yeah, so that can mean listening to lectures or media, like nowadays with social media and internet. There's so many sources of information, the news, books, magazines, or even conversations with people. So just taking in information in various ways that again kind of feeds our afflictions, increases our afflictions. And then habit, yeah. So the more you do it, the easier it is to do it again and again and again. So meditation, we're trying to develop opposite habits. We're trying to, habituate ourselves to positive states of mind, positive ways of being that are opposite to the afflictions. Love, compassion, non-attachment, contentment, faith, wisdom, and so on and so forth. So more familiarity with those will help to decrease the afflictions. And the last one? Yeah, inappropriate attention. That just means like obsessive thinking again and again and again about your objective attachment or aversion, and kind of finding more and more reasons why you should have attachment or why you should have aversion. So yeah, like a court case, building a court case against your enemy, the person you dislike. Or I guess it's not really a court case, but what, building up lots of reasons why you should be with that particular person or buy that particular object. Yeah. So this is really, really helpful to learn about those and see them in our life. And then there are things we can do to work on them, reducing the factors, the causes and conditions for afflictions to pop up in our mind. And then learn the antidotes, many, many antidotes. They're not really explained so much in the Lamrim, but we can find them in other sources like Lojong, thought transformation, and Shantideva, a whole chapter about how to have less anger, how to work on anger, decrease our anger. And then a lot of methods in chapter 8 on how to decrease attachment, desire. It's good to have a good toolbox of methods for working on the afflictions. And use them. Don't just keep them in the box. I'm saying that to myself too. You know the antidotes, but you don't always use them. Okay, so we didn't get as far as I thought we would today, but we'll continue next week. Any last question? Any question before we finish? Very quiet today. Okay, so let's dedicate the merit, share the merit of this session with all sentient beings, especially for our attainment of awakening.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it, have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Losang's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their sufferings. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.